all you literary legends and luminaries. I'm Julie, and welcome to another episode of Booksmart. Today's book is a serious one, a true story about a Super Bowl player who ended up homeless. It's called You Ought to Do a Story About Me, Addiction, An Unlikely Friendship, and the Endless Quest for Redemption by Ted Jackson. Ted Jackson is a photojournalist for a paper in New Orleans way back in 1990. He's out doing a story on the homeless that set up a little camp under a bridge. Jackson finds Jackie Wallace under the bridge with plastic as a blanket and an orderly little area of folded clothes. When Wallace wakes up, Jackson interviews him. Wallace tells him that he played in the NFL and even went to the Super Bowl. He tells Jackson, "You ought to do a story about me." Jackson gets that a lot as a journalist, but when he returns to the office, he seeks out the sports writers and finds out that Wallace did, in fact, play for the Vikings, the Colts, and the Rams. No one knew what happened to him after that. So the paper did, in fact, write a story about him. Jackson becomes Wallace's friend for the next 30 years. During that time, he learns much about Wallace, which all of that becomes the book you are reading. The obvious question is, what happened? How did an NFL player end up homeless? The initial answer that Wallace gave Jackson was this one during the first interview when he went back with his sports writers. He said he'd been out of football for 10 years. He said he still wasn't sure why he got cut. "I had a good year," he said, as he talked about his last season. He said he knew he'd lost a little speed, but as a cornerback, experience was more important than speed. He was still feeling healthy and productive. Then suddenly, his career was over. He tried to get on with other teams, he said, but nobody was interested in him. He said he was homeless by choice. He tried living in the St. Thomas housing projects, but he'd grown tired of the violence there. He wanted to be alone, he said. "I scoured the surroundings and backgrounds for details. Graffiti overhead, red, for birds only. Our society says you have to live in a house and wear Gucci shoes," he said. In an odd comparison, he quoted scripture and compared himself to Jesus. "Foxes have dens to live in and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place even to lay his head." Then he added, "I have to do what I see fit on my own terms." Jimmy scribbled notes and flipped pages as fast as he could. "So far, I've been lucky," Jackie said. "I haven't had to dig in garbage cans to find food. I know how to go 2 days without eating. I'm extremely fortunate and extremely blessed." Jackson, as he writes the story, flips back and forth, especially in the beginning, comparing his childhood and upbringing to Wallace's childhood. Jackson's childhood was a relatively straight-laced one and rather sheltered. Despite the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War, Jackson knows little about what is going on in the world. Meanwhile, Wallace grows up in the projects. He has natural athletic abilities and is encouraged by his teachers and coaches to play sports. Wallace is also a good student and works hard. Jackson uses these contrasts as a foil at times, highlighting the differences in their worlds, yet Wallace succeeds nonetheless. I'll let you read about all the details in between, but Wallace eventually finds his way to the NFL. He's already married and has a baby on the way. If you love football, you'll enjoy the sports details with Wallace's plays and such. I watch football only because my husband and son do, so I don't mind it, although I have a very short attention span for it and usually find other ways to entertain myself, like watching the game and commenting on it as though it's Mystery Science Theater. Anyway, after 7 years in the NFL, Wallace is essentially a has-been. He's old and bruised and had a reputation for being too aggressive, which says something considering we are talking about football. He's divorced and remarried, has 2 mortgages to pay. He was tempted by drugs before, but this time he does crack cocaine. And you can imagine what happens after that. You can read the book to find out all of those details. I'm going to focus on 3 aspects that Jackson brings up in the book: CTE, addiction, and God. CTE is the progressive neurodegenerative disease found in people who experience repeated head trauma, commonly found in athletes, usually connected with concussions, but not always. Both wives report seeing impulsive, violent, and paranoid behavior from Wallace, behavior that seemed out of character for him. His first wife even called the cops on him for rape. At a much earlier age than expected, Wallace showed signs of memory loss as well. Once the NFL has concussion protocols in place and award retired NFL players compensation for CTE, Wallace applies and takes the tests, but he passes them. According to Jackson, the NFL has paid out very little to those who do have CTE. I wish Jackson would have spent just a little more space developing this issue, as I think it plays a huge role in Wallace's decline into homelessness. However, I think addiction is the primary reason Wallace is homeless. Thanks to his NFL pension, drug dealers know that Wallace has money coming in every month, so he always has enough drugs drugs at his disposal, Jackson suspects that Wallace has an addictive personality long before the drugs because he displays addictive tendencies toward women as well. Wallace has several stints in rehab and does the whole NA thing. He relapses several times. Jackson loses Wallace several times throughout those 30 years. The first time Jackson loses contact with Wallace, they didn't have a really close relationship. Wallace would call every Thanksgiving, but otherwise they didn't contact each other all that much. Once Jackson finds Wallace after thinking he was dead, they keep in touch much more often, and later Jackson is even one of Wallace's sober contacts. The paper even writes about Wallace's whereabouts and that he is missing. Let me read you a part where Jackson cannot locate Wallace the first time after all those calls stop at Thanksgiving. Jackie Wallace hung in my gut like a dull ache. His disappearance bugged me much more deeply than it should have. Photojournalists are supposed to use the camera to create an emotional barrier to grief and tragedy. We're supposed to maintain professional distance to become mere observers. But not this time. I couldn't understand why I cared so deeply. Drug addicts relapse all the time. Sweet stories turn sour on a regular basis. Pedestals crumble. Heroes disappoint. We all stand on feet of clay. Perhaps ego and pride had gotten the best of me as well. Was Jackie's disappearance proof that my crowning journalistic achievement had failed? As if verifying this, my speaking engagements now ended with a desultory addendum. Sadly, I'd say to my audience, we don't know where Jackie is today. And I'd watch people's faces fall in disappointment. In some speeches, I considered dropping Jackie's photos and his story from my program altogether. I wanted my happy ending back, but for whatever reason, I kept them in. I kept telling his tale and trying hard to keep his memory intact. Jackson and Wallace are both religious. So in terms of the God topic, Jackson believes that God brought them together, that the initial newspaper article saved Wallace's life, and that it was a miracle that continued to bring them together, that a whole community of people were looking out for Wallace, and that is how he survived. I'm very much a what-if sort of person, so I enjoyed the part the newspaper played in the story as if fate had brought them all together for a reason. But what really intrigued me is way at the end of the book, when Jackson is writing about addiction again. He's assessing his own behavior. Jackson is addicted to his smartphone and sugar, but obviously those things won't lead to a path of homelessness, nor will he be socially ostracized for them. He lists all the things people are addicted to other than drugs: sex, gambling, video games, pornography, shopping. And then he writes this: the point is that my brain and Jackie's brain are more alike than I care to admit. If we are honest with ourselves, we can all identify some action or behavior that controls us. This leads into Johann Hari, who argues that addiction may not be a chemical dependency after all, but an adaptation to a negative environment. There was a study done in the 60s and then again in the 80s using a rat in a cage with cocaine. The isolated rat used the drug until it killed him. Another psychologist, Bruce Alexander, tried a slightly different experiment, which I will read to you. And it is incredibly interesting. Alexander wondered if the rats would react differently if the cages were larger and filled with toys, spinning wheels, tunnels, and maybe most important, male and female rats. In a controlled experiment, he and colleagues built two sets of environments. One replicated the tiny solitary confinement of the earlier experiments. In the other, they built a large virtual rat wonderland. Alexander named it Rat Park. In both sets, the rats had 2 water bottles to drink from. Alexander filled one with pure water. He filled the other with water laced with morphine. The results were staggering. The solitary rats drank 25 milligrams of morphine a day. In their small, empty cages, they had nothing to do but get high and die. Meanwhile, in Rat Park, the rats drank less than 5 milligrams a day. Instead of lapping up the morphine, the citizens of Rat Park preferred to play, explore, enjoy the scenery, and have sex. In the isolated cages, nearly 100% overdosed and died, as opposed to none in Rat Park. Bruce concluded that the addiction and overdoses must be blamed on the rat's environment, not the drug itself. The addiction wasn't a disease, he said. It was an adaptation. It's not you, he said. It's the cage you live in. How fascinating. Yet such a study didn't receive much attention whatsoever. Alexander follows this up with Vietnam War vets. Those that picked up heroin addiction in Vietnam who came back home to supportive environments stopped using drugs without any sort of rehabilitation services. Those that couldn't stop using had been addicts before the war. Johann Hari said that the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. I could have read much more about that, but it only takes up 3 pages in the book. Overall, the book tells a beautiful story between two unlikely people that maybe were brought together by fate or God, if you're religious. Jackson approaches the story as a journalist, so it feels like you're reading one really long article in a newspaper or magazine. It's a bit bland at times, but that's due to my preference for the narrative style of memoirs over the textbooky tone of articles. Because Jackson is a photojournalist, he includes pictures throughout the book. I wish he would have provided more because I like seeing those photographic elements tell their own story. What I really appreciated about the book was that it made me stop and think. When we see someone panhandling on a corner, or if you live in huge cities and drive past homeless camps built up in undesirable areas of town, we have no idea what led homeless people down that path. We can assume addiction, but we really have no idea what led initially to that addiction. It could be an undiagnosed mental condition. It could be a result of childhood trauma. It could be that due to circumstances beyond their control, they found themselves without a place to call home. There are so many reasons that those of us who take for granted the roof over our heads would never dare to think of. I teach at a juvenile detention center, and every time a student writes about being grateful for being at JDC because they have a safe place to sleep and 3 meals a day, my heart breaks. It's easy for society to criticize and judge and assume that these students are going to end up in prison anyway. But maybe they didn't have to if their own families weren't dealing with addiction, abuse, and poverty. You Ought to Do a Story About Me is worth a read and your time, for it will broaden your perception of the world in which we live. You may think twice before criticizing or condemning others, or maybe it will just force you out of your oblivion. And that's all a good book really should do. Make you pause and think about the world in which you live. Thanks for watching. My goal at Booksmart is to get a little bit smarter, one book at a time.